I think we have to remember what we're talking about here. Each of the Diablo Canyon reactors has, while operating within it, 15 billion curies of radioactivity. We measure permissible concentrations in picocuries. That's millionths of a millionth of a curie. Put differently, there is in each of those reactors 1,000 times the long-lived radioactivity of the Hiroshima bomb, and the spent fuel on site 10 times as much as that. If the cooling got disrupted, the fuel melted, you could have enough radioactive release, according to AEC and NRC studies, that you could wipe out a large portion of the state of California for generations. It's an immense amount of radioactivity. And the only way it is prevented from being released is if the cooling keeps working, if the safety systems keep operating, and most importantly, if there is no earthquake. David Brower, the late environmentalist, once defined a nuclear reactor as a complex technological device for locating earthquake faults in California. Essentially, every time we built a reactor in California, we then discovered earthquake faults nearby. PG&E built Humboldt Bay, saying that the earthquake fault nearby wasn't active. A few years later, it was discovered to be active. They had to shut it down. Tried to build one at Bodega Bay, and as they dug the hole, a local geologist went down, a geologist for the local group, and found an active fault in the hole in which they were about to build a reactor. In Davenport, north of where I am in Santa Cruz, PG&E had to abandon a plan for a reactor because of a fault being discovered. But the situation for Diablo has turned out to be far more troubling. I'm going to show you a couple of slides, if I may, for a moment. So when the plant was designed, getting licensed, PG&E asserted that there were no active earthquake faults within 30 kilometers, none. And so they were, in their construction permit hearing, the local group asked to put on an afternoon's worth of testimony by a geologist that there were active faults nearby. PG&E objected. The licensing board voted 2-1 to not hear the testimony. Tom Pigford, head of nuclear engineering at UC Berkeley, dissented, saying, shouldn't we find out before we pour concrete if there are earthquake faults? But he was overruled. So they started to build the reactor, got the construction permit license in December of 1970, and a few months later, Hoskins and Griffiths, two geologists for the oil industry, found the Hosgri fault, just a few miles away from the reactor. PG&E initially denied it existed. When that failed, they then denied it was active. When that failed, they denied it could cause a large fault. And when that earthquake, when that failed, they eventually had to admit it. But by that time, 80% of the plant was built. And rather than abandon the plant or seriously upgrade it, they did a trivial hand waving of sharpening pencils to try to claim there would be less ground motion than the plant had originally been designed for. They created an exception for the Hosgri fault because it couldn't meet the design basis of the reactor as a whole. But then they said, don't worry, this Hosgri fault, I'm going to have to give me a second here. There's the Hosgri, coming very close to the reactors. They said, we're highly confident there are no other earthquake faults nearby. And so then a few years later, the San Luis Bay fault was discovered. And they said, don't worry, there won't be any more. And then the Los Osos fault was discovered, also near the reactors. And they said, don't worry, there won't be any more. And then in 2007, the Shoreline fault was discovered, which comes within 600 meters of the reactors, 300 meters from the intakes. And at this point, they were in real trouble. They claimed that the faults at least weren't connected. But in fact, they a few years ago had to admit that the Hosgri and Shoreline faults are connected. And when faults are connected, the longer the fault, the greater the ground motion that can be produced. They then said that the Hosgri and San Simeon faults weren't connected. Now they admit that the Hosgri, San Simeon, and the San Gregorio fault that goes north of me, it goes for hundreds of miles, are all connected. And so now they admit there could be a joint rupture along the Hosgri, San Simeon, San Gregorio fault zone, which runs from south of the reactors to north of San Francisco. So remember, they'd originally said there could not be any faults within 30 kilometers, and now we know that there are 4 and that they're interconnected. They can produce much more ground motion than the plant was designed for. And the whole problem is that earthquake could occur tomorrow. It could occur next week. It could occur in 3 years from now. And if it occurred and was large enough, which these faults are capable of producing, there could be enough ground motion that the coolant is disrupted. You could have pipes break, you could have pumps fail, you could have offsite power fail, so you can't run the pumps. And the fuel would begin to heat up, melt. The volatile radionuclides would be volatilized and be released into the air. You could have absolutely immense radioactive cloud over much of California falling out, with that radioactivity remaining then for generations. So there was a really good reason that Diablo was to be phased out. And that's because we can't count on there not being an earthquake with a ground motion greater than the plant is capable of withstanding, just like at Fukushima. Can't count on that not occurring. And so I want everyone to remember why Diablo is being phased out. It's because it contains an extraordinary amount of radioactivity in it that only stays inside if there's no accident, no terrorist event, no earthquake. And the longer it runs, the greater the risk that one of those things will happen before it is shut down. So this proposal by Governor Newsom, who helped negotiate the deal back in 2016, to break the deal and let the plant run far longer than it was licensed for, than it is capable of safely running, simply places huge numbers of people at great risk. And that's what's at stake here. Thank you.